Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into the darkest corners of royal dining rooms, where a single bite could mean death, and where the most dangerous job in history wasn't being a gladiator or a soldier. It was being the person who ate before the king. Imagine sitting at the most lavish table in the world, surrounded by golden plates and crystal goblets, knowing that the next spoonful of soup could be your last. This was the daily reality for royal food tasters, and tonight you're about to discover why this job was considered a fate worse than execution. So, before we dive into this fascinating story together, I'd love it if you could hit that subscribe button and give this video a like, but only if tonight's tale truly captivates you. And I'm curious, where are you watching from right now? Are you cozy in bed in California, unwinding after a long day in New York, or perhaps listening from somewhere completely unexpected? Drop a comment and let me know. Now, dim those lights, get comfortable. Maybe turn on a gentle fan for some soothing background noise, and let's step back in time together. Picture this. It's a cold morning in 1478, at the court of King Ferdinand of Naples. The grand dining hall is already buzzing with servants preparing breakfast. But before the king even thinks about touching his food, a young man named Giovanni, barely 20 years old, sits down at a smaller table nearby. His hands are trembling, not from the cold, but from fear. You see, Giovanni is the king's praegustator, his official food taster, and this morning, like every morning for the past 6 months, he's about to risk his life for a meal he didn't even order. Now, you might be thinking, how bad could it be? Free food at the palace, right? Well, here's the thing. According to historical records from the Aragonese court, documented by the Italian historian Benedetto Croce, Giovanni had already watched 3 food tasters die before him. 3. One collapsed right at the breakfast table, foaming at the mouth. Another took 2 agonizing days to die from arsenic poisoning. The third, well, the records simply say he expired before sunset after tasting the king's venison stew. Can you imagine going to work every single day knowing those odds? The role of the food taster wasn't just some paranoid medieval invention. It goes back thousands of years. The ancient Roman emperors had them. The Byzantine empresses had them. Even Chinese emperors during the Ming dynasty employed entire teams of tasters. But why? What made rulers so terrified of their own meals? Let's talk about Emperor Claudius of Rome for a moment. Now, Claudius was actually one of the more reasonable emperors, not a crazy tyrant like Caligula or Nero. But in 54 AD, despite having multiple food tasters, he still died from poisoning. The culprit, his own wife, Agrippina, who allegedly bribed the food taster to look the other way. She served Claudius a plate of mushrooms, his favorite dish, laced with enough poison to kill a horse. The taster, a man named Halotus, later testified that he'd been paid the equivalent of a year's salary to simply nod and say the food was safe. According to the Roman historian Tacitus in his work Annals, Claudius died in agony within hours, clearing the path for Agrippina's son Nero to become emperor. So even having a taster wasn't a guarantee of safety. It was just the first line of defense in an endless game of deadly chess. Now let me take you to medieval France, because this is where things get really dark. King Charles VI, who ruled in the late 1300s, didn't just have one food taster, he had 7. 7 different men who had to taste every single dish, every single drink before it reached the royal table. And here's the twisted part. They weren't volunteers. Most food tasters were either prisoners who'd been given a choice between execution and tasting, or they were servants whose families were promised financial support if they died in service. A manuscript from the Bibliothèque Nationale de France describes the daily routine. Each morning the 7 tasters would gather in the kitchen at dawn. The head chef would prepare small portions of everything on the king's menu. Then, in a specific order determined by the royal physician, each taster would consume a different dish. They'd have to wait at least 30 minutes, sometimes up to 2 hours, to see if they showed any signs of poisoning. Vomiting, sweating, trembling, difficulty breathing, dilated pupils. The physicians kept detailed charts of symptoms. Only after all 7 men were cleared would the king's breakfast be served. But here's what keeps me up at night. What about slow-acting poisons? What about toxins that took days to show symptoms? The tasters were essentially living experiments, and nobody really knew if they'd wake up the next morning. There's this heartbreaking account from 1407. I found this in Pierre Samon's dialogues about a food taster named Jacques. He'd been tasting for King Charles for 3 years without incident. 3 years of eating first, of being the human guinea pig, and he'd survived. Then one winter evening he tasted the king's wine. It was a special vintage, a gift from the Duke of Burgundy. Jacques took the required sip, waited the mandatory hour, felt perfectly fine, and gave his approval. The king drank. Jacques went home to his family. 3 days later, Jacques woke up unable to move his legs. By that afternoon, the paralysis had spread to his arms. By evening, he couldn't breathe properly. The same wine that had seemed safe had contained a rare poison, possibly extracted from hemlock or monkshood, that took 72 hours to activate. Jacques died before midnight. The king, who'd drunk far less, survived but spent weeks recovering. Jacques left behind a wife and 4 children. The royal court gave his widow a single gold coin and a sack of grain. That was his life's worth. Are you still with me? I know this is heavy, but I promise it gets even more fascinating. Let's jump forward to Tudor England, because the Tudors took food paranoia to a whole new level. When King Henry VIII sat down to eat, and trust me, Henry ate a lot, there was an elaborate ceremony that would make modern security protocols look simple. I'm talking about a process described in the royal household records at Hampton Court Palace. First, the food would be prepared in a completely separate kitchen, far from the main palace. Why? Because Henry was terrified of assassins sneaking into the cooking area. Second, armed guards would escort the food through the corridors. Third, and this is where it gets interesting, there were actually 2 levels of tasters. The first taster, usually a lower-ranking servant, would taste the food in the kitchen immediately after it was cooked. If he survived 30 minutes, a second taster, a gentleman of higher rank, would taste it again right before it was presented to the king. Only then would Henry even look at his meal. But here's the psychological torture of it all. These tasters had to act enthusiastic about the food. They couldn't just grimace and swallow. They had to smile, compliment the chef, make the food look appetizing. Imagine trying to seem happy and relaxed while potentially drinking poison. The mental toll must have been astronomical. There's a letter, preserved in the British Library, written by a man named Thomas Culpeper in 1541, where he describes his brief time as one of Henry's tasters. He wrote to his brother, "Each meal is an eternity. I taste the roasted swan and must declare it delicious, though my tongue searches for the bitterness of poison. I sip the wine and must praise its vintage, though my throat tightens with fear. I have lost 2 stone in weight, not from illness, but from the terror that steals my appetite on my own time. I pray nightly for dismissal from this honour that feels more like damnation." Thomas requested a transfer to military service within 3 months. He preferred facing French cannons to facing the king's dinner. Now, you might be wondering, what did these poisons actually do? How did they work? Well, the most common royal poison was arsenic, odourless, tasteless, and readily available in the medieval and Renaissance periods. Arsenic kills by causing multi-organ failure. First, you'd feel nauseous, then violent stomach cramps, then vomiting and diarrhea so severe you'd become dehydrated within hours. Your skin would take on a greyish tone, you'd feel confused, disoriented, and finally your heart would simply give out. The whole process could take anywhere from hours to days depending on the dose. The cruel genius of arsenic was its versatility. A large dose would kill quickly, perfect if you wanted someone dead before they could name their attacker. But small doses over time, that would mimic natural illness. The victim would seem to be wasting away from disease, and no one would suspect murder. This is exactly what happened to Francesco de' Medici, Grand Duke of Tuscany, in 1587. His food taster, a man whose name history sadly didn't preserve, died of what court physicians called a sudden fever. 2 days later, Francesco himself fell ill with identical symptoms. Both had been poisoned with arsenic, administered in gradually increasing doses over several weeks. The taster, eating smaller portions, succumbed first. Francesco followed shortly after. Modern forensic analysis of Francesco's remains, conducted by researchers at the University of Florence in 2010, confirmed lethal levels of arsenic in his hair and bones. But here's something that'll really make you think. Sometimes, the food tasters weren't trying to protect the king at all. Sometimes, they were part of the plot. Remember Halotus, Emperor Claudius's taster who was bribed? He wasn't an exception. He was part of a pattern. In the Byzantine Empire, there are records of at least a dozen instances where food tasters were paid off by conspirators. The going rate, according to Byzantine financial records, about 5 years' salary, enough to set up your family for life, assuming you could escape to another kingdom before the plot was discovered. And that's the thing about this job. If you were a food taster, you were constantly being approached by people wanting to bribe you, threaten you, manipulate you. You became a crucial piece in everyone's political games. Say you're a taster for Queen Elizabeth or Rose of England. The Spanish want her dead. The French have their own schemes. Disgruntled English nobles are plotting. And you're sitting there, the one person between all those assassination attempts and the Queen's life. The pressure must have been absolutely crushing. There's this account I love from William Camden's Annales. He was Elizabeth III's official historian. He describes an incident in 1584 where one of Elizabeth's tasters, a young man named Robert Carey, discovered poison in the Queen's wine purely by accident. He wasn't even supposed to be tasting that day. He was filling in for another taster who was ill. Robert took the mandatory sip and immediately felt his tongue go numb. Having been trained to recognize this symptom, he spat the wine out and raised the alarm. An investigation revealed that the regular taster had called in sick because he'd been paid to stay away that day. The poison was meant to go undetected. Robert's accidental presence saved the Queen's life. Elizabeth rewarded him with land and a title. But here's the kicker. Robert never served as a taster again. He told the Queen he'd rather die in battle than live with that daily fear. She understood and transferred him to military service. He went on to become a war hero. But he later wrote that nothing he faced in combat, not cavalry charges, not sieges, not naval battles, ever terrified him as much as that single sip of wine. Let me share one more story before we transition, because this one really captures the absolute insanity of being a royal food taster. We're going to Russia, to the court of Ivan the Terrible in the 1560s. Now, Ivan was called Terrible for good reason. He was paranoid, violent, and unpredictable. And his food tasters? They had the worst job in history. Ivan didn't just have his tasters sample his food. He would sometimes force them to eat entire meals, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, meant for him. If they survived all three, he'd eat the next day's meals. But if they showed any sign of illness, even just an upset stomach from overeating, Ivan would assume poison and order the entire kitchen staff executed. According to the Illustrated Chronicle of Ivan, Ivan went through 47 food tasters in a 10-year period. Some died from actual poison. Some died from being executed for Ivan's paranoid suspicions. Some simply fled in the night, preferring to live as fugitives rather than continue in that role. One taster, a man named Grigory, lasted 3 years, a record at Ivan's court. When asked how he survived so long, Grigory allegedly said, "I pray before each meal, not to live, but to die quickly if death must come. A fast poison is a mercy in this palace." That quote comes from the writings of a German diplomat, Johann Taube, who visited Ivan's court and recorded what he saw. Grigory eventually did die, not from poison, but from what the court records called exhaustion of the spirit. He simply stopped eating one day, even food that had been tested by others. He wasted away in his chambers, refusing all meals. Modern psychologists would probably diagnose it as severe PTSD and depression. Back then, they just said he'd lost his will to live. And honestly, can you blame him? Think about the psychology of this job for a moment. Every meal is a potential death sentence. You can't enjoy food, something that's supposed to be pleasurable, nourishing, social, because it's been weaponized. You can't trust anyone in the kitchen. You can't trust the servers. You can't even trust your fellow tasters, because any one of them might be compromised. You're living in a constant state of hypervigilance, waiting for the symptom that means poison, the sensation that means your life is ending. The average tenure of a royal food taster across all European courts between 1400 and 1700 was 18 months. 18 months. Some died, some went insane, some begged for reassignment. Very few retired peacefully. It was a job that consumed you, one way or another. Now, here's a question I want you to think about. Would you do it? If you were living in poverty, struggling to feed your family, and the royal court offered you the job of food taster, with good pay, comfortable quarters, and the prestige of serving the crown, would you take it, knowing the odds, knowing the stories? Drop your honest answer in the comments. I'm genuinely curious where you draw that line between survival and self-preservation. Before we move on, I want to leave you with one final image. Picture the grand dining hall of Versailles in the 1680s, during the reign of Louis XIV, the Sun King. Crystal chandeliers, marble floors, gold leaf everywhere. The king sits at the head of an enormous table, surrounded by nobility in silk and jewels. But before he eats, a plainly dressed man sits at a small side table. He tastes the soup, the bread, the wine, the roasted pheasant. He waits. Everyone watches him. The conversation dies. They're all staring at this one man, waiting to see if he'll live or die. His survival is the price of their meal. It's the most elegant form of human sacrifice ever devised. And that taster, he's just one piece of an incredibly complex and dangerous system surrounding royal food. Because the rules didn't stop at having someone taste your meals. Oh no! The restrictions, the protocols, the absolutely bizarre requirements around what royals could and couldn't eat. That's where things get truly strange. So stick with me, because next we're diving into why kings across Europe were absolutely forbidden from eating shellfish, and the shocking medical reasons behind that ban that most people never learned in history class. Trust me, you won't believe what I found in the royal medical records. Alright, so we've just uncovered the terrifying world of poison tasters. Those brave or perhaps desperate souls who literally risk death with every bite. But now, let's talk about something even more fascinating. the foods that were completely off limits to royalty, even when they were perfectly safe, and at the top of that forbidden list, shellfish. Now, I know what you're thinking. Shellfish? Really? That's what we're worried about. But trust me, the story behind why European kings and queens couldn't touch lobster, oysters, or clams is way more complicated and way darker than you might imagine. Let me take you back to June of 1413 to the coronation banquet of King Henry V of England. The Great Hall at Westminster is packed with nobility from across Europe. We're talking about one of the most important celebrations in medieval England. The royal kitchens have been preparing for weeks. There are roasted peacocks, gilded swans, whole boars glazed with honey. But you know what's conspicuously absent from the king's table? Anything from the sea with a shell. According to the Coronation Roll, preserved in the National Archives in London, the menu specifically notes, "No creature of shell-bearing nature shall grace His Majesty's table, on pain of the cook's dismissal and possible imprisonment." That's right. The chef could be thrown in prison just for serving the king a shrimp, but why? Well, the official reason, the one they'd tell you in public, was about dignity and class. Shellfish were considered bottom feeders, creatures that ate garbage and waste from the ocean floor. And there was this whole medieval philosophy, documented in dietary texts like the Regimen Sanitatis Salernitanum from the 12th century, that said you become what you eat. Kings couldn't eat lowly creatures because it would literally lower their royal essence. Sounds ridiculous, right? Except here's the thing. They were accidentally correct, just for the wrong reasons. See, medieval physicians didn't understand bacteria or toxins, but they did notice patterns. And the pattern they noticed was this. People who ate shellfish from certain areas got violently, horribly sick. Sometimes they died, and nobody could figure out why some shellfish were fine while others were deadly. So the solution, particularly for royalty, was simple. Ban all of it. Let me tell you about King John of England. Yes, the bad King John from the Robin Hood stories. Well, John died in 1216, and for centuries historians debated what killed him. The official story was dysentery, but there's a contemporary account by a monk named Roger of Wendover, writing in his Flowers of History, that tells a different story. Roger claims that King John, while travelling through the east of England, stopped at a coastal town and, against all advice, demanded to eat fresh oysters. He'd been craving them for days, apparently. The local monks warned him that the oysters from that particular bay had made people sick. John, being John, didn't care. He was the king. He'd eat what he wanted. According to Roger's account, John consumed a surfeit of oysters and new ale on the evening of October 12th, 1216. By the next morning he was violently ill. Within a week he was dead. Now, modern historians debate whether it was really the oysters or something else. Food poisoning, dysentery, even poisoning by enemies. But Roger was convinced. The shellfish killed the king. And this story became legend. It was told and retold in royal courts across Europe as a cautionary tale. Remember King John, they'd say. Remember what happened when a king ate oysters. It became part of the reason why shellfish bans were enforced so strictly. But here's where it gets medically interesting. We now know about something called paralytic shellfish poisoning, or PSP. It's caused by toxic algae that shellfish filter and accumulate in their tissues. Symptoms include tingling lips, numbness, difficulty breathing, and in severe cases, complete paralysis and death. There's no antidote. And here's the terrifying part. You can't cook it out. Heat doesn't destroy the toxin. A perfectly cooked, delicious-looking oyster can still kill you if it's contaminated. In 2015, researchers at the University of East Anglia did a study analysing historical records of unexplained royal deaths in coastal areas. They found at least 17 cases between 1200 and 1600 where European royalty died, with symptoms consistent with PSP after visiting coastal regions. 17. And those are just the documented ones. So those medieval physicians, with their theory about corrupt humours and poisonous vapours from the sea, they were actually onto something real. They just didn't have the scientific language to explain it. Now, let's hop over to France, because the French took the shellfish ban to a whole different level. King Louis IX, later St. Louis, actually made it a religious issue. In the 1250s, he declared that eating shellfish was not just medically dangerous, but spiritually corrupting. He cited biblical passages about creatures of the sea without fins or scales being unclean. Never mind that this was originally about Jewish dietary laws and didn't really apply to Christians. Louis was trying to make a point about royal purity. There's this beautiful illuminated manuscript from 1260, now held in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, that shows Louis IX at a feast. The artist very carefully illustrated every dish on the table. Fish with fins? Yes. Fish with scales? Absolutely. But there's a small scene at the bottom of the page showing a servant being led away by guards, and if you look closely he's carrying a platter of what appear to be crabs. The caption, in medieval French, reads, "He who brings shame to the table brings shame to the kingdom." That servant was probably just trying to impress the king with an exotic dish. Instead, he likely lost his position, maybe worse. But here's where I need to tell you about the exceptions, because there are always exceptions, right? And the exceptions are where things get really juicy. Queen Elizabeth of England, she loved oysters, absolutely loved them. But she couldn't eat them publicly because of the ban. So what did she do? According to John Stow's Survey of London, Elizabeth had a private arrangement with oyster fishermen from Colchester. They'd deliver fresh oysters directly to her private chambers, and she'd eat them alone or with her most trusted ladies-in-waiting. It was an open secret at court. Everyone knew, but nobody talked about it publicly because, well, you didn't question the Queen. There's even a record of expenses in the royal household accounts from 1575 that lists private provisions for Her Majesty's personal table, a suspicious line item that historians believe was code for her secret shellfish habit. Elizabeth was risking her reputation and potentially her health for oysters. That's dedication. And she wasn't alone. King Charles II in the 1660s was notorious for his love of seafood. He'd host private shellfish suppers at night, away from the formal court. Samuel Pepys, the famous diarist, attended one of these suppers in 1667 and described it in his diary. The king did eat a great quantity of prawns and lobster, laughing all the while at the absurdity of the prohibition. He declared that no rule made by dead men should govern what a living king puts in his mouth. Charles actually tried to officially lift the shellfish ban in 1664, but his advisers talked him out of it. They argued that if the king publicly ate shellfish and then got sick, which was a real possibility, it would be seen as divine punishment. The monarchy couldn't afford that kind of symbolism, especially since Charles's father, Charles III, had been executed just 15 years earlier. The crown was still fragile, so Charles kept eating his lobster in secret and the public ban remained in place. Now here's a question for you. Can you imagine having unlimited power and wealth, but not being able to eat something as simple as a crab cake in public? Like, you're literally the king. You can declare wars, you can execute people, you can change laws, but you can't have shrimp scampi at a state dinner? The absurdity of it is kind of hilarious when you think about it, but the consequences were dead serious. Let me tell you about what happened in Spain in 1598. King Philip II was dying, slowly, painfully, from multiple ailments. He was bedridden at the Escorial Palace, and in his final weeks, he apparently developed intense cravings for the foods of his youth, including shellfish from the Mediterranean coast. His physicians refused. They cited the ban, the danger, the impropriety. Philip, in tremendous pain and facing death anyway, begged them. According to Father José de Sigüenza, who wrote a detailed account of Philip's final days in his History of the Order of St. Jerome, the king said, "I am dying already. What harm can a mussel do to a dying man? Let me taste the sea one last time." They still refused. Philip II died without getting his last wish. And when his son, Philip III, heard this story, he was apparently so moved, or perhaps guilty, that he quietly amended the royal household rules. Shellfish could now be served to the dying. It was a small mercy, but it was something. The medical reality behind all this fear was actually pretty valid, though. Beyond PSP, there's also something called Vibrio infection, bacteria that thrive in warm coastal waters and accumulate in shellfish. Symptoms include severe diarrhea, vomiting, and in people with weakened immune systems, it can be fatal. And guess what? Many European royals had weakened immune systems from inbreeding, from lead poisoning, from their fancy dishes and cosmetics, from lack of exercise and poor overall health despite their wealth. A study published in the Journal of Medical Biography in 2008 analysed the health records of European monarchs from 1500 to 1800. They found that royalty actually had higher rates of foodborne illness than the general population, probably because they ate more exotic foods, more meat, and their food was handled by more people, each one a potential source of contamination. The very things that made royal food special also made it dangerous. So when you add shellfish into that mix, food that's incredibly perishable, that can harbour invisible toxins, that requires careful sourcing and handling, yeah, the risk was real. But here's what's fascinating to me. The ban created this weird paradox. Shellfish became forbidden fruit. The more you couldn't have it, the more desirable it became. There are accounts of young princes sneaking out of palaces to eat at common taverns, specifically because they served clams and mussels. It was an act of rebellion, a way to feel normal, to experience something real that their royal status denied them. Prince Henry, the eldest son of King James I of England, was famous for this. Before his tragic death in 1612 at age 18, probably from typhoid fever, Henry would apparently disguise himself and go to London fish markets with a few trusted friends. A letter from one of his companions, written years later and preserved in the British Library, describes how Henry would buy oysters from street vendors and eat them standing there in the market, grinning like a kid getting away with something naughty. He did declare, the letter says, that no French wine or roasted swan at his father's table tasted as sweet as those common oysters eaten in freedom among the people. Isn't that heartbreaking? This boy, who would have been king, finding joy in something as simple as eating a forbidden oyster in a public market, and then dying before he could inherit the throne, never knowing that kind of simple freedom again. The shellfish ban persisted in various European courts well into the 18th century, even as scientific understanding improved. Why? Because by then it wasn't really about health anymore. It was about tradition, about maintaining the mystique of royalty, about keeping that separation between monarchs and common people. If a king ate the same food as a fisherman, what made him special? There's a great quote from the French philosopher Brillat-Savarin. writing in 1825 in his work The Physiology of Taste. The table of a king is not merely a place to dine, but a stage upon which power is performed. Every dish is a statement, every prohibition a reminder of difference. The king who eats as common men eat ceases to be sacred. That's what the shellfish ban really represented. The idea that royalty was fundamentally different from everyone else, down to the molecular level of what they could digest. It wasn't until the late 19th century, with the rise of refrigeration and better understanding of food safety, that these bans really started to fade. Queen Victoria of England actually loved lobster and wasn't shy about it. By her reign, the old prohibition seemed quaint and outdated. But even Victoria had rules. Lobster could only be served at private dinners, never at state banquets. The tradition died hard. And you know what? Modern royal families still have food restrictions, though they're framed differently now. The British royal family, for instance, has an unofficial rule against eating shellfish when travelling abroad. The reason? Not superstition or class distinction, but simple pragmatism. If you're on a state visit and you get food poisoning from bad shrimp, it's an international incident. So they avoid high-risk foods as a security measure. The reasoning has changed, but the result is the same. Royals don't eat shellfish, at least not in public. So let me ask you this. If you were offered the crown, knowing you'd have to give up certain freedoms, even something as small as eating lobster in public, would you take it? Is unlimited power worth the endless restrictions? Think about that, and drop your thoughts in the comments. I'm curious what you'd sacrifice for a throne. The shellfish ban is just one example of how food rules controlled royal lives in ways that seem bizarre to us now. But if you think that's strange, wait until you hear about the actual physical rules around eating, the regulations about how royals had to touch their food, how they had to hold their utensils, the elaborate hand-washing rituals that could take 20 minutes before a single bite. And if they got it wrong, well, the consequences could be severe. So stay with me, because we're about to dive into the strangest dining etiquette rules ever created, where the wrong fork could get you banished from court, and where simply touching your food with your fingers might be seen as an act of treason. You know what's wild? We've been talking about poison and forbidden foods, but here's something that'll really blow your mind. There were royal courts where the actual act of touching your food with your hands could get you executed. Not exaggerating. Executed. For using your fingers to eat. Welcome to the strange, obsessive world of royal table etiquette, where a fork wasn't just a utensil, it was a symbol of civilization itself, and your life could depend on holding it correctly. Let me paint you a picture. It's 1533, and we're in the court of Catherine de' Medici in France. Catherine, originally from Florence, has just married the future King Henry II. She's brought with her something the French court has never seen before. Personal dining forks. Not serving forks. Those existed. But small individual forks for each person at the table. The French nobles are confused, scandalized even, according to the memoirs of Brantôme, a courtier who witnessed this. One French duke actually stood up at dinner and declared, "God gave us fingers to eat with. To use these devil's implements is to insult his creation." He threw his fork on the floor and ate his roasted chicken with his hands, grease running down to his elbows, making direct eye contact with Catherine the whole time. It was a power move, a statement that said, "We don't need your Italian innovations." Oh, but Catherine was patient. She understood something that would change European dining forever. Controlling how people eat is controlling how they behave, and controlling behavior is controlling power. Within 20 years, the fork became mandatory at the French royal table. Not optional, mandatory. And here's where it gets dark. If you were caught eating with your fingers at a formal dinner in the court of King Henry III, Catherine's son, you could be fined, publicly humiliated, or in extreme cases banished from court entirely. Your political career could end because you picked up a piece of bread with your bare hand instead of using a fork. Does that sound insane? Because it should. But let me explain the twisted logic behind it. In the medieval and Renaissance mind, there was this concept called the Great Chain of Being, basically a hierarchy that put God at the top, then angels, then humans, then animals, then plants, then minerals. Everything in its place. And one of the key distinctions between humans and animals was that humans use tools. Animals eat with their mouths directly. Humans supposedly use implements. So when you ate with your hands, you were literally, in their worldview, lowering yourself to the level of an animal. And a king or queen couldn't do that. Royalty had to be the pinnacle of humanity, the closest to divine. Using a fork wasn't just good manners. It was a theological statement. There's this fascinating book called Galateo, written by Giovanni della Casa in 1558. It's basically the first etiquette manual ever published. Della Casa writes, "It is not seemly to scratch yourself at table, nor to spit, nor to put your fingers in your ears, and certainly not to touch the food with hands that have not been ceremonially washed. For hands that touch common things cannot touch the sacred meal without contamination." Sacred meal, he's talking about dinner, regular food. But in the royal context, every meal was treated like a religious ceremony. Now let's talk about the hand-washing rituals, because this is where things get absolutely ridiculous. Before King Louis XIV of France would eat, there was a ceremony that involved no fewer than 7 servants and took approximately 15 minutes. I'm not making this up. This is documented in the Almanac Royal, the official record of court procedures. First, a page would bring in a golden basin filled with warm water scented with rose petals. Second, another servant would bring a fine linen towel specifically woven for the king's hands only. Third, a nobleman, not a servant, but an actual noble, would pour the water over the king's hands while he held them over the basin. Fourth, another noble would offer soap. Not regular soap, but soap made from olive oil and lavender prepared by the royal apothecary. Fifth, more water for rinsing. Sixth, the linen towel for drying. And seventh, a final inspection by the king's physician to ensure the hands were properly clean. 15 minutes for washing your hands before every meal, and if any step was performed incorrectly, if the water was too hot, if the towel had a wrinkle, if the pour wasn't smooth, the entire ceremony would start over. The nobles performing this ritual were constantly anxious. Their reputations depended on executing a perfect hand-washing. But here's the kicker. After all that elaborate washing, the king still couldn't touch his food directly. Everything, and I mean everything, had to be eaten with utensils, even bread. There are portraits of Louis XIV eating, and if you look closely you'll see he's using a fork to eat bread. Bread. The most basic, meant-to-be hand-held food in existence. A courtier named Saint-Simon, who kept detailed diaries of life at Versailles, described watching Louis eat breakfast one morning in 1702. The king wanted to eat a croissant, a simple pastry, but court rules dictated he couldn't touch it. So a servant had to cut it into small pieces, and Louis ate each piece with a fork. Saint-Simon wrote, "His Majesty consumed the croissant with such delicate precision that not a single crumb fell to the plate by accident. It was a performance of control, a demonstration that even in eating, the king was master of all things." Can you imagine that level of self-consciousness? Not being able to just grab a piece of bread and bite into it, having to perform perfection at every meal, knowing that dozens of people are watching and judging your every movement. But wait, it gets weirder. In some courts, particularly in Spain under Philip IV in the 1640s, there were rules about which fingers could touch which utensils. According to the Etiquette of the Royal Palace handbook preserved in the Spanish National Archives, the thumb and first two fingers of the right hand were designated for holding the fork. The ring finger and pinky had to remain extended, never curled. The left hand could only touch the knife, and only with specific fingers in specific positions. Why? Because there was a belief, totally unfounded but widely held, that different fingers had different humours or essences. The thumb was associated with logic and control, the pointer finger with direction and will, the middle finger with balance, but the ring finger and pinky were associated with emotion and base instinct, so they couldn't be trusted with the important task of conveying food to the mouth. Yes, they assigned personalities to fingers and built dining etiquette around it. There's a tragic story about a young Spanish nobleman named Don Carlos, son of Philip III, who in 1608 was dining at a formal court banquet. He was 19 years old, nervous, trying to impress his father, and in a moment of distraction, he picked up his fork with all 5 fingers wrapped around the handle, the way literally any normal person would hold a fork. The entire table went silent. His father stared at him. A bishop who was present actually gasped and made the sign of the cross, as if Don Carlos had committed blasphemy. The young man realized his mistake immediately. His face went red. He tried to correct his grip, but the damage was done. According to the court record, Philip III didn't speak to his son for 3 days after that dinner. 3 days of silent treatment because of how the kid held a fork. Don Carlos never fully recovered his father's approval. He died young, at 27, and some historians believe the constant pressure of court etiquette, the fear of making tiny mistakes that carried huge consequences, contributed to his deteriorating mental health. Now, you might be wondering, did they ever relax? Was there any time when royals could just eat normally? The answer is complicated. Some monarchs had private dining rooms where the rules were supposedly relaxed. But even then, servants were present. Witnesses were everywhere. King George III of England, according to his private secretary's journal from 1788, would sometimes eat alone in his chambers specifically to avoid the stress of formal dining. The journal entry reads, "His Majesty took cold meat and bread in private this evening, expressing relief at being freed from the weight of ceremonial consumption." Think about that phrasing. The weight of ceremonial consumption. Eating had become a burden. But here's where the psychology gets really interesting. These rules weren't just about control from above. They also became a source of pride and identity for the royals themselves. Using perfect etiquette, never touching food directly, performing these elaborate rituals, it became proof that they were different, special, superior. There's a letter written by Queen Victoria to her daughter in 1858, preserved in the Royal Archives at Windsor. Victoria is teaching her daughter proper dining etiquette before the girl's marriage to a German prince. She writes, "You must never, under any circumstance, allow your fingers to make contact with food. This is what separates us from the common class. They eat with their hands because they know no better. We use implements because we are civilized. This is not merely about cleanliness, my dear. It is about demonstrating to the world that we are worthy of our position." Worthy. She actually used that word. As if your worth as a human being could be measured by whether you use a fork or your fingers. And this mentality had real-world consequences. There are documented cases of nobles who refused to eat at all, rather than break etiquette rules. In 1644, during the English Civil War, a royalist lady named Charlotte de la Trémoille was trapped in a besieged castle. Food was scarce. The remaining meals were simple, meant to be eaten with hands, things like hard bread and dried meat. But Charlotte had been raised with strict table rules. She couldn't bring herself to eat with her fingers. According to a letter from another survivor of the siege, Charlotte wasted away, eating only tiny portions that she could manage with the few pieces of silverware available rather than abandon her training. She survived the siege but barely, and her health never fully recovered. She literally chose potential starvation over breaking etiquette. That's how deeply these rules were ingrained. Now let me tell you about the opposite extreme, because not every royal court was so strict. In Russia, particularly under Catherine the Great in the late 1700s, there was actually a movement toward more relaxed dining. Catherine was influenced by Enlightenment ideas and wanted to seem modern and rational. She hosted informal dinners where guests could, gasp, eat with their hands if they wanted. But even Catherine's informal dinners had rules. According to the memoirs of Charles Masson, a French tutor at her court, Catherine's relaxed dinners still required specific dress codes, assigned seating based on rank, servants standing at attention throughout the meal, and absolutely no one could begin eating before Catherine took her first bite. So informal was relative. Masson wrote, "The Empress declared these suppers to be free from ceremony, yet we were more nervous at these casual affairs than at formal banquets, for we did not know what was permitted. At least ceremony has clear rules. Informality has hidden traps." Isn't that profound? Sometimes too much freedom is more stressful than clear restrictions. At least with strict rules, you know exactly what's expected. The obsession with not touching food reached its peak, or maybe its most absurd point in Qing dynasty China. The Qianlong Emperor, who ruled from 1735 to 1796, had a rule that no food could be touched by human hands at any point from kitchen to mouth. Not by servants, not by the emperor himself, not by anyone. How did they manage this? With an elaborate system of specialized tongs, scoops, and implements. According to records from the Imperial Household Department, there were over 200 different types of eating utensils in the emperor's collection. There was a specific spoon for soup, a different one for rice, another for tea. There were tiny tongs for picking up individual grains of rice if necessary. There were jade chopsticks, gold chopsticks, silver chopsticks, each for different types of food. The logic was that precious metals could detect poison. Silver in particular was believed to change color in the presence of certain toxins. So using silver utensils was both about etiquette and safety. 2 birds, 1 very expensive stone. But here's the really mind-blowing part. Food preparers in the imperial kitchen also wore special gloves made of silk, and they used tools to handle ingredients. A chef couldn't knead dough with his hands. He had to use wooden paddles. Couldn't shape dumplings with his fingers. Had to use molds. The belief was that human touch corrupted the purity of food meant for the emperor. A Jesuit missionary named Jean-Denis Attiret, who visited the Qing court in 1743, wrote in his letters back to France, "I have witnessed the preparation of the emperor's meal, and it is less a kitchen than a workshop, less cooking than engineering. Everything is done with instruments. The human hand, which God designed for creation, is forbidden from this process. It is as if they believe the emperor exists in a realm beyond human touch." When those letters reached France, they were read at the court of Louis XV. And you know what happened? French nobles started imitating it. Within a decade, there were French aristocrats trying to eat entire meals without touching food directly, using increasingly elaborate utensil collections. It became a competition. Who could eat the most difficult foods with the most impractical implements? There's a hilarious account from 1755 of a French duke attempting to eat grapes using only a fork and knife, no fingers. He managed to stab one grape, but it shot across the room and hit another nobleman in the face. Instead of laughing, which would have been the normal human response, everyone pretended it hadn't happened. They just continued eating in silence, because acknowledging the absurdity would mean admitting the whole system was ridiculous. And that's the thing about these food-touching rules. Everyone knew, on some level, that they were excessive, but no one could admit it without undermining the entire social structure that their power depended on. It was a collective delusion that everyone participated in because the alternative, admitting that kings were just regular humans who should be able to eat with their hands like everyone else, was too dangerous to contemplate. So let me ask you something. In your own life, what rules do you follow just because that's how it's done, even if they don't make sense? We all have them, right? Little social rituals we perform to fit in, to seem proper, to maintain our position in whatever hierarchy we're part of. Drop a comment and tell me about a rule you follow that you secretly think is pointless. I'm genuinely curious if we're that different from these royals, or if we're all just playing our own version of the same game. The fork rules, the hand-washing ceremonies, the prohibition against touching food, these were all part of a larger system of control. But they were also symptoms of a deeper anxiety. Because when your entire identity is based on being special, being different, being above everyone else, you have to constantly prove it. And food, something everyone needs, something fundamentally equalizing, becomes a battleground for demonstrating superiority. But if you think table etiquette was complicated, just wait. Because we haven't even touched on what happened when royal children were brought into this system. The dietary restrictions placed on princes and princesses from the moment they could eat solid food were absolutely brutal. We're talking about rules so strict, enforced so rigidly, that they literally stunted the growth and damaged the health of future kings and queens. And the reasoning behind these childhood food rules? It'll make you question everything you thought you knew about how royalty raised their heirs. If you thought the adult rules were bad, what happened to royal children will absolutely break your heart. Imagine being 4 years old. You're hungry. You see an apple on the table. Ripe, red, perfect. You reach for it. And immediately 3 adults rush over to stop you. Not because the apple is poisoned, not because it's rotten, but because apples are on your forbidden list. You're a prince, and princes don't eat apples. At least not until you turn 7. And even then, only certain varieties prepared in specific ways served at approved times. This was the reality for royal children across Europe, and the consequences were far worse than anyone wants to admit. Let me introduce you to Prince Felipe Prospero of Spain. Born in 1657, he was the heir to the Spanish throne, the hope of the Habsburg dynasty. His parents, King Philip V and Queen Mariana, were desperate for a healthy male heir. They'd already lost several children in infancy, so when Felipe was born, they did everything the royal physicians recommended. Everything. And those physicians had very specific ideas about what a prince should eat. According to medical texts from the Spanish court, preserved in the Biblioteca Nacional de España, royal children were put on extremely restrictive diets based on the theory of humours. The idea was that children had naturally hot and moist constitutions, too much vital energy that needed to be cooled and dried through careful food selection. So what did that mean in practice? No fresh fruit. Too moist, too cooling, would cause digestive disturbances. No vegetables except in winter, and even then only cooked until soft. Raw vegetables were considered dangerous. No water, only weak wine or beer, because water was thought to dilute the blood. Very little meat until age 12. Meat was too heating for young constitutions. The primary foods approved for young Felipe: bread soaked in wine, boiled grains, occasional fish, sugared almonds as a treat. That's it. That was the diet they fed the future king of Spain. By the time Felipe Prospero was 3 years old, court portraits show a pale, thin child with dark circles under his eyes. He looks exhausted, malnourished. By age 4, he couldn't walk properly, his legs were too weak. The court physician noted in his records that the prince was delicate in constitution, prone to illness, with limbs that lack vigour. Felipe died 2 weeks before his 4th birthday. The official cause, they called it natural weakness. But modern medical analysis of the historical records, published in a 2011 study in the journal Pediatrics International, concluded that Felipe Prospero almost certainly died from severe malnutrition and vitamin deficiency. His restricted diet had literally starved him to death, even though he was one of the wealthiest children in the world, and his parents never questioned it. They thought they were doing everything right, following the best medical advice available. They believed they were protecting their son. Instead, they killed him with kindness and ignorance. This wasn't an isolated case. This was the standard across royal households. Let's jump to France, because the French took childhood dietary restriction to another level entirely. The Dauphin, the heir to the French throne, had a documented diet plan from birth. I'm talking about a literal written schedule of what could be eaten at what age, down to the specific hour of the day. In the archives of Versailles, there's a document called Le Régime du Dauphin from 1751, outlining the dietary rules for the infant prince who would eventually become Louis XVI. Let me read you some highlights, and I want you to imagine enforcing this on a baby. From birth to 6 months, mother's milk only, but the mother must avoid all spiced foods, all acids, all sweets. She may eat only boiled chicken, bread, and mild cheese. From 6 months to 1 year, pap made from bread and milk given precisely 3 times daily. No variation in recipe permitted. From 1 to 3 years, introduction of cooked vegetables, but never raw. Carrots and turnips only. Potatoes forbidden as they are food of peasants and unsuitable for royal blood. From 3 to 7 years, plain meats may be introduced, chicken and veal only, beef forbidden as too coarse, pork absolutely prohibited, fish permitted on Fridays only. Now, here's the part that kills me. There's a footnote on this document, added in different handwriting, probably by a later physician. It reads, "Despite strict adherence to this regimen, the Dauphin remains small for his age and lacks vitality. Recommend even stricter controls." Their solution to a malnourished child was to restrict his diet further. Let that sink in. And this poor kid, who would grow up to be Louis XIII, struggled with obesity and health problems his entire life. Some historians think his obsession with eating later in life, which became a subject of mockery at court, was a direct result of being so restricted as a child. The moment he had any freedom, he overate. It was a trauma response to childhood deprivation. There's this heartbreaking diary entry from his sister, Madame Elisabeth, written when Louis was about 9 years old. She describes sneaking him extra pieces of bread because he was always hungry. She wrote, "My brother watches the servants eat with such longing. He asked me today why they are permitted cheese with their dinner when he is not. I had no answer that would not reveal the cruelty of our customs. A 9-year-old prince envying the servants their cheese. That's not normal. That's institutional abuse dressed up as royal protocol." But we need to talk about the gender differences, because royal daughters had it even worse in some ways. Princesses were put on dietary restrictions designed to keep them thin and pale, the beauty standard of the time. But these weren't just beauty rules, they were political. A princess needed to be marriageable, needed to attract powerful foreign princes. Her appearance was a diplomatic tool, so her diet was weaponized from childhood. Princess Charlotte of Wales, daughter of King George the Thaw, was born in 1796. Her dietary regimen, documented in letters from her governess Lady de Clifford preserved in the royal archives, is absolutely horrifying. From age 5, Charlotte was allowed only dry toast for breakfast, plain chicken or fish for lunch, no sauce, no seasoning, and a single boiled egg for dinner. That was it. Every day. The same meals. For years. Lady de Clifford wrote to a friend in 1805, "The princess grows increasingly pale. She complains of constant hunger. I have been instructed to ignore these complaints, as His Majesty believes a light figure is essential for her future prospects. My heart breaks daily, but I am bound by duty." Charlotte was 9 years old when that was written. 9 years old and chronically hungry, and the adults around her knew it and did nothing. When Charlotte was 16, she began secretly eating food brought to her by sympathetic servants. She'd hide bread in her room, eat it in the middle of the night. Her governess discovered this and reported it to the king. Charlotte was punished. Her servants were dismissed and guards were posted to ensure she couldn't receive unauthorized food. Think about that. They put guards on a teenage girl to prevent her from eating extra food. Not to stop her from escaping, not to protect her from attackers, to stop her from eating. Charlotte died at age 21 during childbirth. Her baby died too. Medical records indicate she was severely weakened, likely anemic, possibly suffering from nutritional deficiencies that compromised her ability to survive labor. The dietary restrictions of her childhood and adolescence may have contributed to her death. Now you might think different cultures would have different approaches, right? Maybe Asian courts were more sensible? Not exactly. In imperial China, young princes faced equally bizarre restrictions. According to the records from the Forbidden City, published in the book The Last Emperor's Governess by Reginald Johnston, young princes of the Qing dynasty were forbidden from eating anything that embodied aggression. What does that mean? No predatory animals, no carnivorous fish, no eagles, no tigers. Obviously those weren't common foods anyway. But it extended to no crabs, because they walk sideways and therefore are deceptive. No duck, because ducks fight and are thus warlike. The logic was that eating aggressive animals would make the prince aggressive, and a good emperor needed to be balanced and wise. So young princes ate mostly grains, vegetables, carefully selected peaceful fish like carp and chicken, because chickens were considered docile. But here's the problem. Growing boys need protein. They need fats. They need diverse nutrients. A diet of primarily grains and vegetables doesn't provide that. So many young Chinese princes grew up small, weak, and sickly. And then their enemies would use this as propaganda, saying the dynasty was weakening, that heaven was withdrawing its favor. It became a self-fulfilling prophecy. They restricted the boys' diets to make them virtuous, which made them weak, which made them look unfit to rule, which undermined their legitimacy. Puyi, the last emperor of China, wrote in his autobiography, From Emperor to Citizen, about his childhood diet. He described being hungry constantly, dreaming about food, asking his tutors why he couldn't eat the same meals as the servants who seemed so much healthier and stronger. His tutors told him, "You are destined for heaven. You cannot eat as earthly beings do." Puyi noted that he didn't feel destined for heaven. He felt dizzy, tired, and perpetually unsatisfied. He was 7 years old when he wrote about this in his later recollections. Let me tell you about the vitamin deficiency diseases that plagued royal children because of these insane diets. Rickets was incredibly common, a disease caused by vitamin D deficiency that causes soft, deformed bones. You get vitamin D from sunlight and certain foods like fish and eggs. But royal children often weren't allowed much sunlight. Too common, too dangerous, and their restricted diets limited vitamin D intake. A study of royal portraits from 1500 to 1800, published in the Journal of the Royal Society of Medicine in 2005, found visual evidence of rickets in approximately 40% of painted royal children. Bowed legs, curved spines, enlarged joints. It's right there in the paintings, hiding in plain sight. Artists painted what they saw, and what they saw were malnourished children. Scurvy, vitamin C deficiency, was another one. You prevent scurvy by eating fresh fruits and vegetables. But remember, most royal children couldn't have raw fruits or vegetables. Everything had to be cooked, which destroys vitamin C, so royal children would develop bleeding gums, loose teeth, fatigue, and poor wound healing. There's a medical diary from the court of Louis XIV, where the royal physician describes treating the king's grandson for mysterious bleeding and weakness. The symptoms are textbook scurvy. The physician's treatment? More restrictions, more purifying foods. The child got worse. Of course he did. He needed an orange, not another bowl of boiled grain. And the psychological damage was just as severe as the physical damage. Growing up with constant food anxiety, constant monitoring, constant control over one of the most basic human needs, eating, created deeply dysfunctional relationships with food that lasted into adulthood. King Henry VIII of England is famous for his massive appetite and obesity later in life. But historical records show he was kept on a very restricted diet as a child. His older brother Arthur was the heir, so Arthur got priority in everything, including food. Young Henry was often fed leftovers, simpler meals, less meat. When Arthur died suddenly and Henry became heir at age 10, everything changed. Suddenly Henry had access to unlimited rich food, and he never stopped eating. His childhood scarcity created adult excess. The same pattern appears over and over. Restricted in childhood, obsessive about food in adulthood. Now here's something that might surprise you. The common children, peasant kids, merchant kids, even lesser nobility, were generally healthier than royal children. They ate simpler food, sure, but they ate more variety. They ate fresh fruit when it was available. They ate vegetables from their gardens. They drank water from wells. They ran around outside and got sunlight. A comparative study of skeletal remains from medieval London, published in The Lancet in 1998, found that children buried in common graves had fewer signs of nutritional deficiency than children buried in elaborate noble tombs. The poor kids had stronger bones, better dental health, and fewer signs of chronic illness. The royal children, with all their wealth and privilege, were being slowly poisoned by the very systems meant to protect them. So why did this continue for so long? Why didn't anyone stop it? Because admitting the system was wrong would mean admitting that common people knew better than doctors and advisors. It would mean admitting that traditional wisdom was flawed, and that was unthinkable. The entire social hierarchy depended on the idea that royalty was superior in every way, including in knowledge about child-rearing. There's a letter from Queen Victoria to her eldest daughter Vicky in 1859, where she's giving advice about raising Vicky's own children. Victoria writes, "You must not allow sentiment to override proper dietary discipline. Children will always want sweets and fruits, but this is their base nature asserting itself. We must train them to prefer what is good for them, even if they protest. The common classes indulge their children's whims and look at the result, coarse, unrefined, lacking in discipline. The result Victoria is criticizing? Common children who are generally healthier, taller, and had better teeth than royal children." But she couldn't see it. The ideology was too strong. It wasn't until the late 19th century, with advances in nutritional science and pediatric medicine, that these practices started to change. And even then, it was slow. As late as the 1920s, some royal households were still restricting children's diets based on outdated humoral theory. Let me ask you this. What do we do today, in the name of what's best for children, that future generations will look back on with horror? What are our blind spots? Because I guarantee we have them. Every generation does. Drop your thoughts in the comments. What modern parenting trend do you think we'll regret? The tragedy of royal childhood diets is that it was all done with good intentions. Loving parents, trying to protect their children, following expert advice, doing everything right, and still causing tremendous harm. But the food rules didn't just affect what royal children ate. They were part of a much larger picture of how food was used as a language at the royal table. A complex system of symbols and signals where every dish, every placement, every seating arrangement carried political meaning. The dining table wasn't just a place to eat. It was a battlefield where wars were won and lost, where alliances were forged and broken, where a misplaced salt cellar could spark an international incident. And understanding this secret language of royal table settings? That's where things get truly fascinating. Here's something most people never realize. At a royal banquet, nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing, was placed on that table by accident. That golden salt cellar positioned 3 inches to the left of the king's plate? Political statement. The distance between the French ambassador's chair and the Spanish envoy's seat. Calculated insult. The specific type of wine served to each guest. A coded message about their current standing at court. Every fork, every napkin, every decorative flower arrangement was a word in a secret language that everyone at the table was frantically trying to read. And if you misunderstood the message, if you sat in the wrong chair, reached for the wrong glass, or heaven forbid, touched a dish meant for someone of higher rank, you could destroy your career, your family's reputation, or even trigger a war. Welcome to the most dangerous game of musical chairs ever invented. Let me take you to Vienna, 1515. The Habsburg court is hosting a diplomatic dinner. The Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian Yam is trying to negotiate a marriage alliance with the King of Hungary. Everything is riding on this dinner going well. The seating arrangement has taken 3 weeks to plan. Court officials have measured the distances between chairs with actual rulers. They've debated the angle of each seat. They've consulted precedent books going back 100 years. And then the Hungarian ambassador arrives and sees where he's been placed. 4 feet from the emperor's table. 4 feet. The French ambassador is 3 feet away. The Venetian envoy is 3.5 feet. According to the diary of Maximilian's secretary, the Hungarian ambassador stood frozen in the doorway. His face went white. He turned to his aide and whispered something. Then, without saying a word to anyone else, he walked out. Just left. The entire delegation followed him. They rode back to Hungary that same night. The marriage alliance fell apart. Years of negotiation, destroyed because of 6 inches of floor space. You think I'm exaggerating? I wish I were. But there's a whole book, De Ceremoniis Aulae Byzantini, written by Emperor Constantine VII in the 10th century. That's literally a 500-page instruction manual on table placement and seating protocols. 500 pages about where people sit at dinner. Constantine writes, "The science of placement is the science of empire. He who controls the table controls the perception of power. Distance from the emperor's seat is distance from the sun. Each foot represents a degree of warmth, of favor, of influence." To err in placement is to err in governance. Think about what he's saying. The physical distance between chairs is a measurable unit of political power, and everyone understood this language. When you walked into a royal banquet hall, you could read the current political situation just by looking at who sat where. But it gets so much more intricate than just distance. Let's talk about the salt cellar, because salt was the single most important object on any royal table, and its placement could make or break you. In medieval and Renaissance Europe, there was usually one massive ornate salt cellar, often made of gold, encrusted with jewels, shaped like a ship or a castle. This wasn't just for seasoning. This was the dividing line of the entire social hierarchy present at that meal. If you sat above the salt, meaning between the salt cellar and the head of the table, you were important. You were nobility, a favoured courtier, a distinguished guest. If you sat below the salt, on the other side of it, farther from the host, you were lesser nobility, minor officials, or people attending out of obligation rather than honour. And that phrase, below the salt, we still use it today, though most people don't know where it comes from. When we say someone or something is below the salt, we mean it's inferior, not up to standard. The phrase survived centuries because the social structure it described was so rigid, so universally understood. There's a famous incident from 1520 at the court of King Henry VIII. A nobleman named Sir William Bulmer had fallen out of favour with the king for switching allegiance to the Duke of Buckingham. At a state banquet, Henry personally directed that Bulmer be seated below the salt, a position he hadn't occupied since he was a teenager, just starting his court career. According to Hall's Chronicle, a contemporary account by Edward Hall, Bulmer sat through that entire dinner in silence, staring at his plate. He didn't eat, didn't drink, just sat there, enduring the public humiliation. Everyone in that hall understood what was happening. His placement was an announcement. Sir William Bulmer has lost the king's favour. And sure enough, within months, Bulmer lost most of his positions and income. The seating arrangement was the first signal of his downfall, but wait, because the salt cellar's placement could also send more nuanced messages. At the French court under Louis XIV, documented in the Mercure Gallant Gazette from 1686, there were actually multiple salt cellars used at large banquets. The primary one in gold for the king, secondary ones in silver for princes and dukes, and tertiary ones in crystal for lesser nobility. But here's the genius move. If Louis wanted to signal that someone was rising in favour, he'd have servants place them closer to a higher rank salt cellar, not moving them above or below, just angling them toward a better one. It was such a subtle shift that the person might not even notice immediately. But everyone else watching would understand. The king is considering elevating this person. It was political theatre at its finest, and Louis knew it. He once said, according to the memoirs of the Duke of Saint-Simon, "Every meal is a performance. The table is my stage, and seating is my script. I can raise a man or ruin him between the soup and the dessert, and he will not know which until he sees where his chair is placed." Cold, brilliant, terrifying. Now let's talk about what was actually placed in front of each guest, because this is where the symbolism gets really wild. In Byzantine banquets, we're talking 10th to 14th centuries, different guests would receive different foods, even if they were sitting at the same table. This wasn't about dietary restrictions or preferences. This was coded messaging. If you received lamb, it meant the emperor saw you as innocent, needing guidance. Essentially, he was calling you naive. If you received beef, it meant you were seen as strong and useful for labour, not exactly a compliment when you're a visiting dignitary. If you received game birds like pheasant or partridge, it meant you were considered worthy of the hunt, a peer in nobility and wit. There's a Byzantine manual called the Book of Ceremonies that lists all these food symbols. The visiting ambassador from Persia in 917 received primarily fish. Why? Because in Byzantine symbolism, fish represented someone slippery, hard to pin down, not entirely trustworthy. The emperor was calling the Persian ambassador a slippery character through the menu. And the brilliant part? The ambassador couldn't complain without admitting he understood the insult. To object would be to acknowledge that he knew this secret language, which would itself be seen as presumptuous. So he had to sit there, eat his fish, and swallow his pride along with it. The same system existed in China, though with different symbols. According to the book Food in Chinese Culture by Casey Chang, at imperial banquets during the Ming Dynasty, the number of dishes you received corresponded to your rank. The emperor got 12 courses, princes got 9, dukes got 7, and so on. But here's where it gets deliciously petty. If the emperor wanted to insult someone, he'd serve them the correct number of dishes for their rank, but in very small portions. Technically correct, but obviously insufficient. It was a way of saying, you have the title, but not the substance. You are worthy of the form, but not the content. There's a record from 1457 of a duke who received his 7 courses, but each portion was so small it could fit on a tea saucer. He understood the message. He disappointed the emperor somehow. He spent the rest of the banquet trying to figure out what he'd done wrong, while slowly starving at a table full of food. Can you imagine the psychological torture? Sitting at a feast, technically being honoured with the correct number of courses, but given portions fit for a child, while everyone watches and understands you're being punished? Let me tell you about the absolute peak of this symbolic warfare. The placement of the wine glasses. In 17th century France, wine glasses weren't placed on the table initially. They were brought to you when you wanted to drink, then taken away after you'd finished. This was partly about opulence, showing off the number of servants available, but also about control and messaging. The type of glass you received, the quality of wine poured into it, and how quickly a servant responded to your request. All of these were visible indicators of your status at that exact moment. There's a memoir by Madame de Sévigné, a noblewoman at Louis XIV's court, where she describes attending a dinner in 1671. She writes, "I raised my hand to signal for wine, as one does, but the servant, who I know saw me, did not approach. He instead attended to the Duchess of Orleans, who had not yet signalled. I waited, raised my hand again. Finally, after what felt an eternity but was likely 2 minutes, a different servant brought me wine. But the glass. Oh, the glass was of plain design, not the crystal given to others. I knew then that I had somehow displeased His Majesty, though I know not how." She spent the next 3 weeks in terror, trying to figure out what she'd done wrong. Eventually she discovered that she'd been seen speaking privately with a nobleman who'd fallen out of favour. She hadn't known he was in disgrace, but guilt by association was enough. The wine glass was her warning. 2 weeks later she made a public show of snubbing that same nobleman at another event. At the next dinner she attended, she received crystal glass and immediate service. Message received. Behaviour corrected. This is how social control worked. Not through direct confrontation, but through subtle symbolic manipulation that everyone could see, but no one could officially acknowledge. Now here's where table settings became actual diplomatic incidents. In 1661, there was a banquet in London honouring the restoration of King Charles II. Foreign ambassadors were invited. The French ambassador and the Spanish ambassador both attended. And a massive fight, an actual physical brawl, broke out over whose carriage would be positioned first in the arrival procession. Why? Because the order of carriage arrival determined the order of entry into the banquet hall, which determined seating proximity to the king, which signalled which nation had higher prestige in England's view. The Spanish ambassador's servants fought the French ambassador's servants in the streets outside. There were injuries. One person died over the order of carriages at a dinner party. According to the diary of Samuel Pepys, who witnessed part of this chaos, King Charles was furious, not because of the violence, but because the incident forced him to make a public choice about which nation he favoured. The seating arrangement, which should have quietly communicated his diplomatic leanings, instead became an international spectacle. Charles's solution: he uninvited both ambassadors and held the dinner without them. A diplomatic catastrophe, but he saw it as the lesser of two evils. Let me share one more example that shows just how insane this could get. In 1668, at a peace conference dinner following a war between France and Spain, the negotiators spent more time arguing about table setup than they had spent negotiating the actual peace treaty. The discussions went on for weeks. Who would sit at the head of the table? If it was neutral ground, could there be two head seats? How far apart? Could the table be round to avoid hierarchy? But then how do you determine who sits to the right of whom? They finally settled on a square table with 4 head positions, one for each major party. But then they had to negotiate the size of each place setting. Literally. They measured the width of each chair, the length of each tablecloth section, the size of each plate. According to the diplomatic records published in European treaties of the 18th century, they agreed that all place settings would be exactly 18 inches wide. Exactly. They wrote it into the treaty. And before you think this is just historical silliness that we've outgrown, guess what? Modern diplomatic protocol still obsesses over table arrangements. At G7 summits, at UN dinners, at state banquets, there are protocol officers whose entire job is to figure out seating arrangements. They follow complex formulas based on alphabetical order, length of time in office, size of economy, military power, and about a dozen other factors. We're still doing it. We've just gotten better at pretending it's not about power and hierarchy, even though it absolutely is. So here's my question for you. In your own life, what are the seating arrangements you deal with? Maybe it's where people sit in meetings at work. Maybe it's who gets invited to certain group chats. Maybe it's whose opinion gets heard first in family discussions. We all have our own versions of the salt cellar, don't we? Comment below and tell me about a time when you realized that some seemingly small social arrangement was actually a big deal. I'd love to hear your modern equivalent of these royal table politics. The secret language of table settings was just one weapon in the arsenal of royal dining control. But all these rules, the seating, the salt cellars, the symbolic foods, they all depended on one crucial thing: silence. Because in many royal courts, particularly for women, there was another rule that made all of this even more oppressive. A rule so strict, so psychologically damaging, that it turned every meal into a performance of perfect, painful stillness. Queens and princesses, sitting at these elaborate tables with all their coded messages, often weren't allowed to speak. At all. They had to eat in complete silence, communicating only through gestures and expressions, while everyone watched and judged. And the reasons behind this forced silence. They reveal something deeply disturbing about how royalty viewed women, power, and control. Close your eyes for a second and imagine this. You're sitting at the most luxurious dinner table you've ever seen. Crystal chandeliers overhead, gold plates in front of you. The smell of roasted meat and fresh bread fills the air. You're surrounded by dozens of people, courtiers, nobles, foreign dignitaries. Everyone is watching you. Everyone is waiting to see what you'll do, what you'll say, and you're desperately hungry because you've barely eaten all day due to the endless preparation rituals. But here's the catch. You cannot speak, not a single word, not to ask for water, not to compliment the food, not to make polite conversation. You must sit in perfect silence, eating with precise movements, while the world watches. And if you make even the smallest sound, if you accidentally clink your fork against your plate too loudly, if you sigh, if you clear your throat, you will be judged harshly. This was the daily reality for queens and princesses across multiple royal courts, and the psychological damage it caused? We're only now beginning to understand it. Let me introduce you to Isabella of Valois, who became Queen of England in 1396 when she married King Richard II. She was 6 years old. 6. And from the moment she arrived in England, she was subjected to the silence rule at formal dinners. There's a household manual from Richard II's court, preserved in the British Library, called The Boke of Nurture, written by John Russell. It explicitly states, "The Queen shall maintain dignified silence at table, speaking only when directly addressed by His Majesty, and then in voice so soft as to be heard by none but him and those nearest." Think about what this means for a 6-year-old child. She's in a foreign country. She doesn't speak English well yet. She's surrounded by strangers, and at every meal she has to sit in silence, unable to ask questions, unable to express discomfort, unable to be a child. A letter from one of her French attendants, sent back to her mother in France in 1397, describes little Isabella crying silently at dinner because she was confused about which fork to use. The letter, published in Chronicles of the Age of Chivalry, reads, "The child wept without sound, tears falling into her soup, for she has learned that to cry audibly at table brings shame upon her and disappointment to His Majesty." My heart breaks to see a babe of 7 years bearing such burden. 7 years old, crying silently into her soup because she's not allowed to make noise. Let that sink in. But why? Why would anyone impose such a cruel rule? Well, the official explanation, documented in numerous etiquette manuals from the medieval and Renaissance periods, was threefold. First, women's voices were considered naturally shrill and unpleasant. I'm not kidding. Medical texts from the era claim that women's higher vocal pitch was inherently grating to the refined male ear. A dining experience should be peaceful, they argued, and women speaking would disturb that peace. Second, there was the belief that women lacked the education and wisdom to contribute meaningfully to dinner conversation. Political matters were discussed at royal tables. Women, being excluded from education and politics, supposedly had nothing valuable to add. Therefore, silence was appropriate. Third, and this is the one that really reveals the power dynamics, a silent woman was a controllable woman. Speech is power. The ability to voice opinions, ask questions, make requests. These are forms of agency. Taking away a woman's voice at the table was a daily reminder of her subordinate position. There's a quote from the Book of the Courtier by Baldassare Castiglione, written in 1528, that makes this crystal clear. "A woman's greatest ornament is silence. Let her beauty speak where her words should not. A speaking woman at table is like a crowing hen, unnatural and disturbing to proper order." A crowing hen. That's how they viewed women who spoke at dinner, as unnatural, as disturbing the proper order of things. Now, the enforcement of this rule varied by court and by era, but when it was enforced, the consequences could be severe. At the Spanish court under Philip II in the late 1500s, If a queen or princess spoke out of turn at a formal state dinner, she would be required to fast for the next meal as penance. According to the journal of a Spanish courtier named Luis Cabrera de Córdoba, Queen Anna of Austria, Philip's fourth wife, accidentally laughed aloud at dinner in 1572 when a servant tripped and spilled wine. Just laughed. A natural human reaction to an awkward moment. But because it was unseemly noise from the Queen at a formal table, she was required to skip dinner the following evening and spend that time in prayer instead. Anna was pregnant at the time. She needed nutrition. But the rule was the rule. Silence was more important than her health or her baby's health. And this wasn't just about formal state dinners. In some courts, the silence rule extended to all meals. The Empress Maria Theresa of Austria in the 18th century ate most of her meals in complete silence, even when dining privately with her family, because that's how she'd been trained since childhood. Her daughter, Marie Antoinette, wrote about this in letters to friends before she left for France. In a letter from 1769, preserved in the Austrian State Archives, the 14-year-old Marie Antoinette wrote, "Mama dines in such perfect stillness that the only sounds are the gentle placement of silver upon china. Even my younger siblings have learned to eat without a whisper. I confess I look forward to France, where I'm told conversation at table is permitted, even encouraged." Oh, the irony. Marie Antoinette looked forward to the freedom of the French court, and while it's true that French royal women had more permission to speak at meals than their Austrian counterparts, there were still strict rules about what they could say, when, and to whom. At Versailles under Louis XIV, women could speak at dinner, but they could not initiate conversations. They could only respond when spoken to. They could not raise their voices above a certain volume. There were actually volume guidelines, and they absolutely could not contradict anything a man said, especially if that man outranked their husband or father. The Duchess of Orleans, known as Liselotte, was German-born and notorious for speaking her mind. She wrote in her letters, she was a prolific letter writer, about how difficult she found French dining etiquette. In 1701 she wrote, "I must bite my tongue constantly at table. Yesterday, a duke made an entirely incorrect statement about the geography of the Rhine, which I know intimately from my childhood. I wished to correct him, for he was misleading the others, but I could not. To correct a duke would be unforgivable, so I sat in my knowledge and he in his ignorance, and truth suffered for the sake of protocol." That's the thing about these silence rules. They weren't just about etiquette. They were about enforcing ignorance, preventing the flow of information, maintaining power structures. If women couldn't speak freely, they couldn't share knowledge, couldn't challenge false information, couldn't participate in decision-making. Now, let me tell you about the women who broke these rules and what happened to them. Anne Boleyn, Henry VIII's second wife, was famous, or perhaps infamous, for speaking her mind at meals. This was actually part of what attracted Henry to her initially. She was lively, opinionated, engaging, very different from the quiet, dutiful Catherine of Aragon. But once Anne became queen, her talkativeness at formal dinners became a liability. There are multiple reports from courtiers noting that Queen Anne spoke overmuch at table and expressed opinions unbefitting a queen. According to the chronicles of Eustace Chapuis, the Spanish ambassador, Anne would engage in theological debates with bishops during dinner, would laugh loudly, would tell jokes. Chapuis wrote in 1535, "The concubine," his dismissive term for Anne, "conducts herself at table more as a debater than a queen. She speaks when not addressed, contradicts men of learning, and seems to forget that a woman's wisdom is best displayed in quietness." A year later, Anne was executed. Now, obviously her supposed adultery and treason were the official charges, but her behaviour at court, including her refusal to be silent and submissive at meals, had already turned many nobles against her. Her voice, her opinions, her refusal to perform meekness, these were seen as symptoms of a dangerous character. Would she have been executed if she'd been quieter, more traditionally queenly? We'll never know. But the historical record shows that her vocal nature was consistently used as evidence of her unworthiness. Contrast this with Jane Seymour, Henry's third wife. Jane was described by contemporaries as gentle, quiet, and obedient. She barely spoke at meals. She never contradicted Henry. She ate in near silence, eyes downcast, the perfect image of submissive queenliness. And she was beloved by the court, praised as the ideal queen. When she died after giving birth to Henry's son, she was genuinely mourned. Henry, who would eventually have 6 wives, claimed until his death that Jane was his true wife, the one he loved most. Why? Partly because she gave him a son, but also because she performed the role exactly as expected, including the silence. The message was clear. Silent women were safe women. Speaking women were dangerous and disposable. But here's what's fascinating and tragic about the psychological impact of these rules. Many royal women internalized them so deeply that they became unable to speak freely even when the rules were relaxed. Queen Charlotte, wife of King George III of England, was known for being extremely quiet at social gatherings. But according to the diaries of Fanny Burney, one of her attendants, Charlotte desperately wanted to engage in conversations. She would have things she wanted to say, questions she wanted to ask. But she'd been so thoroughly trained in silence from childhood that she physically couldn't make herself speak up. Burney wrote in 1786, "Her Majesty began to express an opinion about the music we had just heard, then stopped mid-sentence, her face colouring. She apologised for speaking out of turn, though no one had suggested she was. I assured her that her opinion was most welcome, but she could not continue. The training of her youth has left scars that even the crown cannot heal." Think about that. A queen, one of the most powerful women in the world by virtue of her position, unable to finish a sentence about music because she'd been conditioned since childhood that her voice was inappropriate, unwelcome, disturbing. The silence rule created generations of women who'd lost the ability to advocate for themselves, to express their needs, to participate in their own lives. And it wasn't just European courts. In Imperial Japan, similar rules existed. The wife of the emperor, the empress, was expected to maintain dignified silence during formal meals. Speaking was permitted only in the most limited circumstances. There's an account from the Meiji period, late 1800s, describing Empress Haruko eating in complete silence, even when dining with just her ladies-in-waiting. The silence had become so habitual that she maintained it even when not formally required. One of her attendants noted that the Empress would sometimes write notes during meals, not speaking, but communicating through written words, because speech felt too transgressive even in private. Can you imagine being so conditioned to silence that you'd rather write a note than speak to your friends? Now here's where the health impacts become really serious. There's a physiological response to chronic suppression of speech. When you constantly swallow words, when you train yourself to not speak, you're creating chronic tension in your throat, your jaw, your chest. Modern research on selective mutism and trauma-induced silence shows that it can lead to anxiety disorders, digestive issues, and chronic pain. We don't have detailed medical records of royal women's health complaints, but we do have scattered references. Many queens and princesses suffered from what was called melancholy, or nervous complaints, what we'd now probably diagnose as depression and anxiety. Many had digestive problems. Many complained of throat pain and difficulty swallowing. Were these caused by the silence rules? We can't prove direct causation, but it's certainly suggestive. When you're not allowed to express yourself at one of the most basic daily activities, eating with others, that repression has to go somewhere. There's a particularly heartbreaking letter from Princess Charlotte of Wales, the same one I mentioned earlier who died in childbirth. In 1815, she wrote to a friend, "I find myself sometimes at dinner with words caught in my throat, as if they are too large to pass through. I wish to speak, to laugh, to join the merriment around me, but I feel a physical barrier. It is as if my very body has learned that speech is danger and protects me by trapping the words inside." Speech is danger. She literally felt endangered by the act of talking at dinner. That's trauma. That's what these rules did to people. Let me ask you this. Have you ever been in a situation where you felt you couldn't speak up? Maybe in a meeting at work or in a family gathering or in a relationship, where you had something to say but felt like saying it would cause more problems than staying quiet. How did that feel? Now imagine that being your entire life, every single meal, from childhood until death. Drop a comment if you've ever felt silenced and how you dealt with it, or didn't. I think a lot of us can relate to these women more than we'd like to admit. The enforcement of silence at royal tables wasn't just about manners or tradition. It was a systematic method of control that had real psychological and physical consequences. And while the explicit rules have mostly disappeared in modern times, you could argue that we still have our own versions, social situations where women are expected to be quieter, to take up less space, to defer to male voices. But here's the thing about all these food rules we've been exploring. The poison tasters, the forbidden foods, the etiquette nightmares, the childhood restrictions, the symbolic table arrangements, the enforced silence. As oppressive as they all were, they pale in comparison to what could happen when food itself became a weapon. Because sometimes royal food wasn't just controlled or restricted or loaded with symbolic meaning. Sometimes it was deliberately, consciously used to harm. And the foods that were forbidden for safety reasons? Well, those prohibitions created a black market, a temptation, a way for the desperate and the ambitious to use forbidden ingredients as tools of political warfare. And some of those forbidden foods, they could start actual wars between nations, which is exactly where we're headed next. There's a moment in history that sounds completely absurd until you understand the context. In 1542, two European nations almost went to war over a potato. Not gold, not territory, not religion. A potato. And before you laugh, let me explain how food, specifically forbidden food, became one of the most dangerous weapons in royal politics. Because when you tell powerful people they can't have something, you've just created the most valuable commodity in the world. And valuable commodities, they're worth killing for. Let's start with that potato story, because it perfectly illustrates the insanity we're dealing with. King Henry VIII of England received a gift from a Spanish merchant in 1542, a crate of strange tubers from the New World, potatoes. They'd recently been brought back from South America, and most Europeans had never seen one before. Henry, always interested in exotic foods despite his physician's warnings, wanted to try them. But here's the problem. The Catholic Church had declared potatoes potentially sinful. Why? Because they weren't mentioned in the Bible. Therefore they might be ungodly. And since England had just broken from the Catholic Church, anything the Pope banned became politically charged. According to a letter from the Spanish ambassador to Charles V, preserved in the archive of Simancas. Henry VIII made a public show of eating roasted potatoes at a state dinner, specifically to insult the Pope. He served them to the French ambassador, who was still Catholic, putting the poor man in an impossible position: refuse and insult the English king, or eat and potentially commit a sin. The French ambassador ate one small piece, then claimed sudden illness and left. This was seen as a diplomatic insult. Relations between England and France, already tense, deteriorated further, and while the potato incident wasn't the sole cause, it contributed to increased military tensions that led to the 1543 invasion of France. A war partly triggered by a potato. I told you it sounded absurd. But the deeper truth is that forbidden foods were always political. Every banned ingredient was a potential chess piece in international relations. Take sugar. In medieval Europe, sugar was incredibly rare and expensive, imported from the Middle East. It was so valuable that it was literally kept in locked boxes, and noble houses would display sugar sculptures at banquets to show off their wealth. But here's the twist. For centuries, the Catholic Church debated whether sugar should be banned during Lent. Why? Because it brought pleasure, and Lent was supposed to be about sacrifice and denial. So if you enjoyed sugar, was eating it breaking the spirit of Lent even if it technically wasn't meat? Different bishops gave different rulings. This created a situation where, in some regions, sugar was forbidden during Lent, and in others, it wasn't. And this became a massive economic and political issue because the sugar trade was worth millions. According to the book Sweetness and Power by anthropologist Sidney Mintz, there were documented cases of merchants bribing church officials to rule in favour of sugar being allowed because a ban would destroy their businesses, and rival merchants would bribe other officials to maintain the ban, to eliminate competition. Food rules became corruption, corruption became policy, policy became international trade disputes, and trade disputes became wars. The sugar wars between Venice and Genoa in the late 1400s were nominally about trade routes and merchant rights. But at the heart of it, control over who could import and sell sugar, including during periods when it was religiously prohibited. According to Venetian state archives, the conflict resulted in over 2,000 deaths and massive economic damage to both city-states over sugar, sweet, innocent sugar. Now let me tell you about coffee, because the coffee story is even wilder. When coffee first arrived in Europe from the Ottoman Empire in the early 1600s, it was immediately controversial. Some Catholic leaders wanted it banned, calling it the bitter invention of Satan. Their logic: coffee was popular in Muslim lands, so it must be Islamic, so Christians shouldn't drink it. But coffee was also incredibly stimulating. It helped people stay awake, focus, work longer. There was huge economic potential, so a debate raged. Should coffee be banned as a corrupting foreign influence, or embraced as a useful tool? The decision ultimately went to Pope Clement VIII in 1600. According to legend, and this is documented in several historical accounts, including The World of Caffeine by Bennett Weinberg and Bonnie Beeler, the Pope's advisors urged him to ban coffee, but Clement decided to taste it first before making a ruling. He took a sip, paused, took another sip, then allegedly declared, "This devil's drink is so delicious, it would be a pity to let only the infidels drink it. We shall fool Satan by baptizing it and making it a truly Christian beverage." Whether that's exactly what he said or not, Clement VIII officially approved coffee for Christian consumption, and that decision changed European history. Coffee houses spread across Europe, becoming centres of intellectual discussion, business dealing, and political plotting, the Enlightenment, the scientific revolution, the rise of newspapers, all were fueled partly by coffee culture. One man's decision about a forbidden beverage literally helped shape modern Western civilization. But not every ruler agreed with the Pope. Some monarchs saw coffee houses as dangerous. King Charles II of England tried to ban them in 1675 because they were places where people gathered and discussed politics, potentially treasonous politics. His proclamation, preserved in the British Library, declared that coffee houses were places where the disaffected meet to spread false and scandalous reports concerning the conduct of His Majesty. He ordered them all closed. The public outcry was immediate and intense. Coffee had become so popular that banning it was politically impossible. Charles backed down after just 11 days, issuing a humiliating retraction. According to the diary of John Evelyn, a contemporary observer, the failed coffee ban damaged Charles's authority more than any military defeat. He tried to control what people drank, and he lost. Food rules could make or break a monarchy. Let's talk about chocolate, because chocolate has maybe the most dramatic forbidden food story of all. When Spanish conquistadors brought cacao back from the Americas in the 1520s, it was exotic, expensive, and delicious. But it was also problematic. Was chocolate a food or a drink? This mattered because of religious fasting rules. During fasting periods, and Catholics had many of them, you couldn't eat solid food, but liquids were allowed, so if chocolate was a drink, you could have it while fasting. If it was food, you couldn't. This question was hotly debated for over a century. Different religious authorities gave different answers. According to The True History of Chocolate by Sophie and Michael Coe, there were at least 40 separate official rulings on chocolate's status between 1569 and 1662. Why did it matter so much? Because chocolate had become incredibly popular among the wealthy. Nobles didn't want to give it up during fasting periods, but they also didn't want to commit sin. So they pressured church officials to rule that chocolate was a beverage. Finally, in 1662, Cardinal Francesco Maria Brancaccio issued a definitive ruling, liquidum non frangit jejunum. Liquids don't break the fast, therefore drinking chocolate was permitted during fasting periods. But here's the sneaky part. People started adding less and less liquid to their chocolate, making it thicker and thicker, until it was basically pudding. They were exploiting a technicality, and everyone knew it. But the ruling had been made, so technically, they were in the clear. This created international tensions because different countries interpreted the chocolate ruling differently. In Spain, thick chocolate was fine. In France, it had to be liquid. In Italy, it depended on which bishop you asked. When the Spanish Princess Maria Theresa married French King Louis XIV in 1660, she brought chocolate-making servants with her. But they prepared chocolate the Spanish way, thick and rich. French religious authorities objected, saying this violated fasting rules. A diplomatic incident erupted. According to the letters of Madame de Motteville, a lady-in-waiting, the chocolate controversy became a proxy for larger tensions between Spanish and French customs at court. Was France going to dictate how the Spanish-born queen consumed her own traditional foods? Or would they accommodate her preferences? It sounds petty. It was petty. But it was also about power, about cultural dominance, about which nation's customs would prevail. Food was the battlefield. The compromise? Maria Theresa could have her thick chocolate, but only in private, not at public functions where it might scandalize French observers. She spent 40 years as Queen of France drinking her chocolate alone in her chambers because it was too controversial to do publicly. 40 years. Imagine being isolated from social dining for 4 decades over hot chocolate. Now let me tell you about the food that caused actual literal wars: spices. The spice trade, pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, was worth more than gold in medieval and Renaissance Europe. Spices were rare, imported from Asia at great expense and danger. They were status symbols, they were medicine, they were preservatives, they were everything. And various rulers tried to control or ban them for various reasons. Sometimes to monopolize trade, sometimes because they were too foreign and therefore suspect, sometimes to punish nations that supplied them. The most dramatic example, the Nutmeg Wars between the Dutch and English in the 1600s. The Dutch East India Company controlled the Banda Islands, the only place in the world where nutmeg grew naturally. They wanted total monopoly. So they declared that trading nutmeg without Dutch permission was illegal. The English didn't accept this. English merchants smuggled nutmeg. The Dutch responded with violence, seizing ships, executing smugglers. According to the book Nathaniel's Nutmeg by Giles Milton, the Dutch governor Jan Pieterszoon Cohen massacred the entire population of the Banda Islands in 1621, about 15,000 people, to maintain the nutmeg monopoly. 15,000 people dead over a spice. The English retaliated: naval battles, diplomatic expulsions, economic sanctions. This conflict dragged on for decades, causing thousands more deaths, and only ended when the Dutch traded Manhattan Island to the English in exchange for the tiny nutmeg island of Run. Yes, that Manhattan, New York City, traded for an island of nutmeg trees, because controlling a forbidden, restricted spice was considered more valuable than North American land. Let that sink in for a moment. The entire trajectory of American history was affected by food politics. Here's another angle. Sometimes foods weren't officially forbidden, but their consumption was so politically charged that eating them was essentially a declaration of war. During the French Revolution, white bread became a symbol of aristocratic excess. The poor ate dark bread made from cheaper grains. So when revolutionaries saw someone eating white bread, it marked them as potentially noble or noble sympathetic. According to memoirs of Pierre Caron, a revolutionary official, there were documented cases of people being arrested and executed, partly because they were seen eating white bread in public during 1793-1794, the height of the terror. The bread itself wasn't forbidden, but eating it was a political statement that could get you killed. Food became ideology. Ideology became life or death. Similarly, during the Russian Revolution, sugar consumption was associated with the bourgeoisie. Revolutionaries were expected to drink their tea without sugar to show solidarity with the working class. According to the historian Orlando Figes in A People's Tragedy, there are accounts of Bolsheviks denouncing fellow revolutionaries for putting sugar in their tea, claiming it revealed hidden aristocratic tendencies. Sugar in tea. That's all it took to be suspected of counter-revolutionary thinking. Let me share one more example that shows how food prohibitions could create bizarre international crises. The tomato controversy of the 1700s. Tomatoes, like potatoes, came from the Americas, and like potatoes, they were viewed with suspicion in Europe. But tomatoes had an extra problem. They're part of the nightshade family, and some nightshades are poisonous. So there was genuine fear that tomatoes might be toxic. For decades, tomatoes were grown as ornamental plants, beautiful but dangerous. Eating them was considered reckless, possibly suicidal. According to The Tomato in America by Andrew F. Smith, this belief was so strong that in 1692, a cook who served tomatoes to a royal household in Naples was actually put on trial for attempted poisoning, even though no one got sick. But here's where it gets political. Different countries approved tomatoes at different times. Italy embraced them by the early 1700s. France remained skeptical until the late 1700s. England didn't widely accept them until the 1800s, and America had regional variations. Some areas ate tomatoes, others forbade them. This created diplomatic awkwardness. If an Italian ambassador visited France and was served a meal without tomatoes, his national cuisine, was it an insult? If a French nobleman visited Italy and was served tomato sauce, was his Italian host trying to poison him? These questions seem ridiculous now, but they were taken seriously at the time. Menus for diplomatic functions had to be carefully negotiated to avoid serving foods that the guest nation considered forbidden or dangerous. There's a wonderful letter from Benjamin Franklin, writing from France in 1784, where he discusses having to mediate between French and American officials over whether tomatoes should be served at a treaty celebration dinner. The Americans from certain regions thought tomatoes were poisonous. The French chef wanted to serve them in a traditional sauce. Franklin, ever the diplomat, suggested a compromise: tomato sauce on the side, optional for those who wish to risk it. His letter, preserved in the Library of Congress, ends with, "I sometimes think we spend more energy negotiating our dinners than negotiating our treaties. Perhaps that is as it should be, for men who cannot agree on what to eat shall never agree on how to govern." Wise words from old Ben. Here's my question for you. What food do you think future generations will look back on and say, "I can't believe they argued about that"? GMOs, meat alternatives, food from specific countries? Comment below with your prediction. I'd love to hear what you think our modern food controversies reveal about our politics and values. The reality is that forbidden foods have always been about more than just food. They've been about power, control, identity, economics, and diplomacy. When you ban a food, you create scarcity. Scarcity creates value. Value creates crime, corruption, and conflict. It's a cycle as old as civilization itself. And all of these forbidden foods, all of these trade wars and diplomatic incidents and political controversies, they had to be implemented somewhere. They had to be enforced by someone. And that brings us to the place where all royal food rules converged: the kitchen. Because if you think the dining room was bad, wait until you hear about what actually happened behind the scenes, in the royal kitchens where all this food was prepared. The conditions were unspeakable, the practices were revolting, and the things that got cooked in those kitchens and served to kings and queens. When you discover the truth about royal kitchen hygiene, you'll never look at palace banquets the same way again. Everything you've seen in movies about royal kitchens, the gleaming copper pots, the pristine marble counters, the army of immaculately dressed chefs working in perfect harmony. Yeah, forget all of that. The reality was so much worse than you can possibly imagine. Picture instead a dark, smoke-filled dungeon, floors slick with animal fat and rotting food scraps. Rats, not just one or two, but dozens, scurrying between barrels of salted meat. The overwhelming stench of burning grease mixed with human sweat and waste. Water dripping from ceilings covered in decades of accumulated soot. And in this nightmare space, people are preparing food for the most powerful rulers in the world. Welcome to the actual royal kitchen. And once you learn what really went on here, you'll understand why so many monarchs died young despite having access to the best food in their kingdoms. Let me start with a description that'll probably make you lose your appetite. In 1683, a health inspector, yes, they had those even back then, filed a report on the kitchens at Versailles, the most magnificent palace in Europe. This document, preserved in the French National Archives, is absolutely horrifying. The inspector, a man named Claude Guénaud, wrote, "The heat is so intense that workers labour stripped to the waist, their sweat falling directly into the pots they stir. The floors are covered in a layer of grease so thick that one slides rather than walks. Dead vermin are visible in corners, and I observed rats feeding from the same barrels used to store ingredients for His Majesty's table. When I inquired about cleaning procedures, I was told the floors are washed when time permits, which appears to be rarely. This wasn't some backwater kitchen. This was Versailles, the palace of Louis XIV, the Sun King, the richest monarch in Europe, and his kitchen was a disease-ridden nightmare. But it gets worse. Guénaud continues. I witnessed a cook retrieve a piece of meat that had fallen to the floor, the same floor I have described, rinse it briefly in a bucket of water that appeared not to have been changed that day, and place it directly into the stew meant for the royal table. When I objected, I was informed this was common practice and that the heat kills whatever the floor adds. The heat kills whatever the floor adds. That was their food safety philosophy. And this was considered acceptable because, well, how would anyone know? The king wasn't going to inspect his own kitchen. He probably never set foot in there his entire life. According to the book At the King's Table by historian Timothy J. Tomasik, most European royal kitchens were built in basements or separate buildings, specifically because they were so disgusting that having them near living quarters was intolerable. The smell alone was enough to make people sick. At Hampton Court Palace under Henry VIII, the kitchen was a separate building connected to the main palace by a long